Okay, so today we're diving into something I think we all struggle with at some point. Boundaries.
Yes.
We're talking about those invisible lines that we draw around ourselves to protect ourselves and our well-being.
Right.
But sometimes they can get a little blurry.
Absolutely.
It's not always easy to know where to draw the line or even how to draw the line.
Right.
And so that's why we're unpacking this book today, Boundaries by Dr. Henry Cloud and Dr. John Townsend.
Great book.
They break this whole concept down in a really practical and understandable way. And you realize as you're reading it, oh, boundaries aren't some like mystical force.
Right.
This is a skill you can actually learn and develop.
Absolutely. It's not like you're born with good boundaries or bad boundaries.
Yeah.
It's something that you cultivate over time.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love that because I think sometimes we see people who just seem to have it all together.
Right.
And we think like, oh, they were born with this like amazing boundary gene.
Right.
But the reality is it's a practice and we can all get better at it.
Exactly.
So I guess like what would be a good analogy for boundaries? Because it's not literally about building walls, right?
No, it's not about building walls. It's more like, think about your life as your own personal property.
Oh, okay.
You have a fence.
Okay.
It's there to define what's yours and what's not.
Right.
It's there to protect what you value. But it's not a prison wall.
Right.
It has a gate.
Okay.
You choose who and what to let in.
I like that.
Yeah.
And one of the things that really clicked for me in this book was this idea that we're only responsible for ourselves. Like, we are not responsible for our partner's happiness or our friends' choices or our parents, whatever it is.
Yeah.
We're responsible for ourselves, our own side of the street.
That's right.
And that's a really freeing concept, but it can also be challenging.
Absolutely.
Because we're so used to kind of like taking on other people's stuff.
Yes, and they tell a story in the book that illustrates this so well.
Okay.
It's about a guy whose lawn was always perfectly green and lush.
Okay.
And everyone's like, wow, your lawn is amazing.
Yeah, what's your secret?
Yeah. He's like, well,
Right.
it turned out it was because his neighbor's sprinklers were watering his lawn.
Oh, no.
So he wasn't actually taking responsibility for his own lawn.
Wow.
He was benefiting from someone else's effort.
Oh, that's such a good visual for this.
And that's a boundary issue.
He wasn't taking ownership of his own grass.
Wow.
And it created this weird dependence.
Yeah, and that's where these boundary problems come in, right?
Yeah.
Because the book talks about different types, like the compliance, who are just like, yes to everything.
Yes.
Even if it's draining them, even if it's not good for them.
Right. They're people pleasers.
Yeah.
They want to make everyone happy.
Right.
And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have the controllers
Okay.
who are terrified of letting go.
Right.
So they try to manage everyone and everything around them.
Oh, so they overcompensate
Exactly.
by trying to control everything.
Yes, because they think if they can just control the external,
Right.
then they can finally feel safe internally.
Wow. And so often I think those patterns start really early on, right?
Oh, absolutely. The book talks about this whole separation individuation process.
Yes.
Which those words felt a little intimidating at first, I'll be honest.
Right. It sounds very clinical.
Yeah, like I need a dictionary.
But they break it down in a way that makes total sense.
Okay.
Basically, it's about how we develop a sense of self that's separate from our parents.
Okay.
So it starts with hatching, which is that stage where babies start to realize, like, oh, I'm actually my own little person.
Okay.
I'm not just an extension of mom.
Right.
And then comes practicing.
Uh-huh.
And this is where toddlers, they're starting to walk, they're mobile.
Yes.
They're all about testing limits, pushing boundaries.
This is where the magic word no comes in.
Exactly. And that no is huge.
Right.
It's not just them being difficult.
Yeah.
It's them practicing.
Establishing their own little boundaries?
Exactly.
Wow.
And eventually they reach rapprochement, which is this stage where they realize, like, okay, I still need my parents,
Okay.
but I could also be my own person.
So all those epic toddler meltdowns are actually a good sign?
In a way, yes.
Oh my gosh.
It's a sign that they're figuring out where they end and the world begins.
Wow.
But here's the thing. Not everyone gets to fully go through these phases in a healthy way.
And that's where those boundary issues in adulthood often come from.
Exactly. We get stuck.
Yeah.
We get stuck in old patterns.
But we're not doomed to repeat them.
No, not at all.
That's the good news.
That's the good news.
Okay.
It takes work, but we can redefine those boundaries.
Okay, how do we do that?
Well, it's about first recognizing those patterns,
Right.
understanding where they came from, and then consciously choosing to do things differently.
And that's where these 10 laws of boundaries come in.
Exactly.
Which sound very official and important.
They are.
So what's the first law?
All right, so the first law is the law of sowing and reaping.
Oh, okay.
And it's basically like that old saying, you reap what you sow.
Okay.
You can't expect to have healthy relationships if you're constantly overgiving,
Right.
sacrificing your own needs, avoiding conflict at all costs.
Like you're not taking care of your own lawn.
Exactly. You're letting your neighbors' sprinklers do all the work,
Yeah.
and then you wonder why your grass is brown and patchy.
Oh, man, yeah. It's about taking responsibility for what we're planting in our relationships, right?
Yes, and that ties into the law of responsibility, which is huge.
Okay.
We can only control ourselves, our actions, our thoughts, our feelings.
Right.
It's not our job to fix other people or to make them happy.
Right.
We are only responsible for ourselves.
But that's so hard sometimes, right?
Yeah.
It's so easy to fall into that trap,
Especially with people we love.
especially with the people we love. And they give this example in the book of this woman, Sarah,
Okay.
who's constantly bailing her adult son out of financial trouble.
Yeah.
And her heart's in the right place.
Right. Of course.
She loves her son. She wants to help him.
Yeah.
But her lack of boundaries is actually making things worse
How so?
because she's enabling his irresponsible behavior.
Oh.
And deep down, she's resentful about it.
And that's what the book talks about too, right?
Yeah.
Is that how resentment can build up in these kinds of situations.
Absolutely, because we're not setting clear boundaries. We're
Yeah.
not honoring our own needs.
Right. It's like we think, well, if I can just fix this person,
Yes.
then I'll be happy.
That's the other control we were talking about.
Right.
We're trying to control the uncontrollable instead of focusing on what we can actually influence.
Our own choices,
Exactly.
which is a lot harder in some ways, right?
It is, because it requires us to look inward.
But it's also empowering, right? Because it's like we're taking back our power.
It is. It's about saying, I am not going to be a victim of my circumstances. I'm going to choose how I respond.
I love that. And, you know, one of the things the book talks about is how these patterns often start in childhood.
Oh, absolutely, with our families of origin.
Yeah, like the mom factor.
Right. The dynamics we learned from our mothers, whether healthy or not, often show up in our other relationships.
It's not about blaming our moms, though, right?
No, not at all. It's about understanding.
Okay.
It's about recognizing those patterns so we can break free.
So give me an example. Like, how would that show up?
Okay, so let's say you had a mom who was very critical.
Okay.
You might find yourself attracting partners who are also critical.
Oh, interesting.
Or if your dad was emotionally unavailable, you might find yourself drawn to partners who are emotionally unavailable.
Wow. So it's like these unconscious patterns are playing out,
Exactly. It's like we're drawn to what's familiar,
even if it's not healthy for us.
even if it's not healthy for us. And the book gives this great example of this woman who realizes she's constantly apologizing in her romantic relationship,
Oh.
even for things that weren't her fault.
Okay. Why do we do that?
Well, in her case, it turned out that her dad was very emotionally volatile.
Okay.
And as a child, she learned that apologizing, even when she hadn't done anything wrong, was a way to keep the peace.
Oh, wow.
So it was a survival mechanism.
Right.
But then she carried that pattern into her adult relationships.
Wow. That's heartbreaking, but also really eye-opening because it's like we don't even realize these scripts are playing out.
We don't, and that's why self-awareness is so important.
Right.
Because once we're aware of the patterns,
Yeah.
we can start to change them.
So how do we change them? How do we rewrite those scripts?
Well, the book really emphasizes the importance of direct communication.
Okay.
It's about expressing our needs and limits clearly and respectfully.
So no more passive aggressiveness.
No more passive aggressiveness, no more hoping the other person will just figure it out.
Yeah, because that never works.
It never works.
So it's about having those tough conversations,
It is, and it's about learning to say no.
which can be so hard.
It can be, especially if you're a people pleaser.
Right.
But it's a muscle that needs to be developed.
Yeah, and that's where the law of motivation comes in, right?
Exactly.
Like checking in with our why.
Yes, why am I saying yes to this?
Yeah.
Am I doing it out of obligation, guilt, fear of disappointing someone?
Mhm.
Or am I doing it because it aligns with my values, my goals, my own well-being?
And I think that's such a good question to ask ourselves in any situation, really,
Any situation.
because it helps us to make sure that we're acting from a place of integrity
Exactly.
rather than just kind of like going along with things.
And the more we can act from that place of internal motivation,
Yeah.
the less we'll find ourselves in situations where we're feeling resentful or taken advantage of.
And then we end up feeling drained and resentful
Exactly.
because we're not honoring our own needs.
Right. Right.
Okay, so we've talked about the importance of direct communication, of saying no, but what about the fear that comes up around that?
Yeah, that's huge.
Right? Because we're afraid of hurting people's feelings.
Mhm.
We're afraid of the consequences of setting those boundaries.
Absolutely, and the book actually talks about that.
Okay.
It says, sometimes setting boundaries will hurt other people.
Right.
It's not about intentionally inflicting pain,
Right.
but it's about taking responsibility for our own well-being.
Yeah.
We can't be paralyzed by the fear of every possible consequence.
That's so true, because I think sometimes we avoid setting boundaries because we're so afraid of what might happen.
Right.
And we end up staying stuck in situations that aren't good for us.
Exactly, and that's why the law of productivity is so important.
Okay, tell me more about that one.
It's about recognizing that we have a choice.
Okay.
We can either stay stuck
Yeah.
or we can choose to take action.
Even if it's scary.
Even if it's scary, even if it's uncomfortable.
And I think that's where having support can be really helpful.
Oh, absolutely.
Because we don't have to do this alone.
No, you don't have to do this alone.
Right. Like, who are those people in your life who can support you in setting those boundaries?
Yes. The book even talks about finding boundary lovers,
I love that term.
right? Those people who will respect and support your boundaries
Yeah.
without making you feel guilty or selfish.
And I think it's so important to have those people in our lives.
Absolutely, because setting boundaries can be challenging,
Yes.
especially at first.
Right.
And so having those people who can kind of cheer us on.
Yeah, like our own personal cheer squad.
Exactly.
Who are just there to remind us that we're worthy
Yes.
of setting those limits, of taking care of ourselves.
Exactly. And that our needs matter.
And that's ultimately what it's all about, right?
Yes.
It's about recognizing that we deserve to have healthy relationships
Absolutely.
where our needs are met.
Yes. And where we feel safe and respected.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive into boundaries, what's like the one thing that really stands out to you?
I think the biggest takeaway for me is that boundaries are not about shutting people out.
Right.
It's about creating space
Yeah.
for healthy connections.
Right. It's about taking care of ourselves.
Yes.
So that we can show up more fully
Exactly.
in our relationships.
And for me, the big takeaway is that boundaries are a practice.
Okay.
It's not like you read this book
Right.
and then you're like, okay, I have boundaries now.
I'm done.
It's an ongoing process.
Right. It's a journey.
It's a journey.
And it's something that we have to keep working at.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for diving into this with me today.
This was fun.
It's been really eye-opening.
Yeah.
And I think a good reminder for all of us that boundaries are important
Absolutely.
and that they're worth the effort.
They are so worth it.
Now, for all of you listening, think about one relationship in your life where you might want to set a healthier boundary.
It could be a small one.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be anything big and dramatic.
Just one small step.
What's one small step you can take this week
Yes.
to move in that direction? And remember, it might feel a little bit scary at first, but your future self will thank you.
That's right.